proud to present Elizabeth Churchill under hashtag TU2, please. And Elizabeth is, I just love to read her work, and I love to spend time talking and listening to her. She's a fresh, original thinker who really understands in a deep way that educates me on this topic. And thank you for being here. All right.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I'm going to talk about a few things that I've been thinking about recently, and you can read the papers if you want more of the sort of details, but I'm going to see if I can cover a few anecdotes, a few thoughts, and I have a particular request. And this very much follows on from what Ben has been saying, and in fact he's covered a lot of the beliefs that I'm going to try and reiterate here through my own lens. But the real takeaway is that as well as researching your own topics, just like Ben said, I want to have us all think about a bigger topic, and that's the notion of data by design and our role in designing the data that are collected as well as how they are analyzed and visualized. Okay? So, when I was invited to come along here and think about some of these concepts and think about the technology-mediated social participation, which I was involved in some of the workshops for, there are sort of two angles to this, which I'm very passionate about. And I'm really going to talk about the second one mostly today. But the first one is really this platforms for mediated communication. And my history, my research in the past was very much about communication online and thinking about the psychology of communication online, the motivations and emotions. Remember I said I was a psychologist. I care about motivations and emotions, not just actions. Okay. So I've done a lot of work on virtual environments and chat spaces and workflow systems, and you can read those papers. But I'm really going to try and focus on the second point, and this is the thing. We, as a group, need to address the design of data for science very explicitly and directly, and think about where that science is going. So on the first point, we know that there are plenty of media platforms that allow us to be aware of other people's activities, our friends. There's conversation, there's content exchange, which is pretty good. Content storage, indexing, and search tends to be quite poor on some of these systems. And I'm thinking about, Facebook and Flickr and so forth. Content sharing needs to be malleable as well as stable. How do I go in and actually work on something with you? Really collaborate on the co-production of something. Coordination should be long-term as well as short-term. And collaborative production should be lightweight as well as complex. And longevity, for a lot of these systems, it's currently questionable. And this, again, picks up on something that Ben said, and I'm going to reiterate through the talk. So here are some of the things that we can think about in that first bucket of mediated collaboration. There's cooperative activities, which are centralized, like GitHub. Then there's collective action, which is centralized, plenty of groups on Facebook. And then there's collective action, which is decentralized. Okay. So these are some different ways that we are using current social media platforms that perhaps have been designed for recreational purposes, especially the sort of Facebook one, for collective action. And I think these are really important for us to study and really important for us to think about. And there are plenty of papers coming out on those topics, and many people in this room said that they were interested in exactly this kind of thing. So I want to say that that is really important. I care about it, and I really want to talk to you all about that issue. How do you design centralized, and how do you orchestrate decentralized kinds of activities? But the second thing is what I really want to talk about today, specifically with some examples from my own work. And one is about, the data quality, right? What are all those data that are being collected? Descriptive data, predictive models over data, observed data versus understood data. I would argue that a lot of the data that are collected are observed, not necessarily really understood. Local versus universal. I'm going to keep repeating this. When you collect those data and you make assertions, does that really apply to the whole of humankind? Or is it very local to the specific context in which those data were gathered? Again, remember, I'm interested in the social sciences about people and the invariance of people's activities. I care about humans and their feelings and their cognition in all contexts, not just particular contexts. Are we reactive or are we proactive in what data exist? I would currently suggest that, especially from some of those media platforms, we're pretty reactive, not proactive. we as scientists are not necessarily being proactive. And are our observations standalone or are they replicated? So Ben talked about interventions. You know, are those interventions single and standalone, or are they comparative? Are they replicated? Are we asking those questions in the right way? Do we understand what the science of this space really is? Science quality is what I'm thinking about. Data stability and longevity. Are we gathering data that we can actually point to and say, that is a really interesting invariant? That is a really interesting observation about humankind in general, about people in general. We need to understand the terms of service for the places that we actually collect those from which we collect those data, right? We need to understand what those content are, and we need to understand who has social responsibility around those content, those data. And you know, is it us as a group, or is it the organizations who host those data? Okay. So, I'm also going to argue that I'm going to reinforce something that's been said already, but you know, we really should be getting designers and statisticians and computer scientists and data scientists and social scientists. This multidisciplinarity is really important, because if we're starting to actually make assertions about the social sciences, about the data sciences, we should have folks talking together. And really what I'm asking everyone to do, whatever bucket you put yourself in, or if you put yourself in any one of these categories, is think of yourself really as a sort of epistemologist or ontologist. I want you to think about where your epistemology comes from. What are the roots? What are the core beliefs of that? And what are the core beliefs and the core roots of the epistemologies and the ontologies of data online right now? What are you finding? What are you not finding? To what extent are you really getting the data you want to answer the questions that you have? Truthfully, honestly, the core things that you care about. And to what extent are you using the data that just happen to be available? I'm just going to keep saying that over and over again. And I'm happy for someone to tell me I'm completely wrong, it's all been solved. So I read this years ago, it's like 2010 or something. It was when data science, you know, we started to sort of think about data science. This was a really quite nice piece. So Riley, of course, has been, you know, very much at the front of writing in an accessible way interesting things that are going on in the technology sphere. And so I would recommend just looking at that. And I went back through it the other day, and I was really interested in what differentiates data science from statistics is that it's a holistic approach. And I really like this. Gathering data, massaging it into a tractable form. How many of us have done that? Making it tell its story and presenting that story to others as if the story somehow resides in those data that we have massaged. I think that's a really interesting assertion. The first step of any data analysis project is data conditioning, or getting data into a state where it's usable. I also think I'm an experimental psychologist by background. Conditioning, it means something very specific to me. It means pellets and rats. And I was wondering in what way I was an agent in conditioning the data, just like I was an agent in conditioning my rats years ago. So I just want you to think about that. The problem with big data is when the size of the data itself becomes part of the problem. We all know that, right? It's going to get bigger. And this I found really interesting. You may not know what's important till after you've analyzed the data. And then do you go back and say, I'm going to do it all again? Do you have access still? Just a question. Data scientists come up with new ways to view the problem. Here's a lot of data, what can you make from it? Some really interesting notions of agency, emergence, and the role of the data scientist in the production of what questions can be answered as well as what questions will be answered. The future belongs to companies who figure out how to collect and use data successfully. What about us as scientists? Does the future belong to us in any sense? It should. This is I told Ben this morning, so I'm going to be an activist. But the bottom line is business logic is not science logic, okay? And there are reasons for that. Here's a really interesting one. This is a nice article. It's quite nicely written, Social Media and the Big Data Explosion. And this is really aimed at marketers, CEOs, etc. And I just want to put this, without revenue, chatter is just chatter. I'm sorry, people. My chatter happens to be my human relationships and my deep connections with other people. My chatter is not just chatter. It is the way in which my friendship is solidified with you. Those things that I share online with you, that YouTube video, that is a proxy for my social relationship to you. The thing, that video, all of the metadata around it, my comments and the fact that I shared it with you, that's about my relationship. That's a placeholder for my relationship with you. It's not just chatter. I'm not saying one is right, one is wrong. I'm just saying these are very different approaches to thinking about it. And as a psychologist who cares about people, I want that chatter to matter. That was an accident. I'm very proud of it, but it was an accident.
Chatter matters.
Yeah, chatter does matter. So there's the data set problem. You know, where you're looking might be what's available to you, and it might be your epistemological particular viewpoint. Okay. And the other piece of this is, I care about design. I care about interface design. I care about interaction design. And that interface that you have, the interface that you're looking at right now, it's sort of like a sieve. It's sort of all of the things that you're thinking. Think about all of that, all of that at the top, the information. Think about that as emotion and communication needs and requirements and desires and hopes and fears. All goes through a button, potentially. Right? Here's an example that I like to give. A few of you have seen this before. So, what do I know? On this side, we have the Western toilette. And this side, we have the Japanese toilet. We have different interfaces that give you choices about what you do in that most private of rooms. I'm a data scientist and I want to know what you do in that most private of rooms. I have a very different picture of you from this one versus this one. Those are interfaces that lead to data, that lead to conclusions and lead to questions and lead to understandings. So I want to put these images in your head so that next time you go online, you start to think about how that incredibly rich limbic system and frontal lobe and motor cortex, when it comes to the connect and your sensors and your devices, gets sort of streamed into particular things that are recorded or are not recorded. Okay. So here's Facebook. There's my Facebook page. What about me will you find out from this? Well, one of the things I know is that this very controversial button is like. I press like when I like it, when I hate it, when I think it's funny, when I just want to reach out and just touch you to let you know that I read it. What does like mean? Okay. I'm not the first person to say any of this stuff. I just want to reinforce it in this room so that we can talk about it more critically as we go forward this week. I've done a lot of work on dating. Anyone in this room dating? I've been on a dating site. Yes. I always ask, and I always get like very few numbers, and I never believe them. I was saying that the data get collected, remember the light. If you're on eHarmony, there's all kinds of questions that get asked of you about your commitment to marriage. That's because there is a particular belief system that is behind that tool, which is called a dating site, just like the other dating site over here, which has a different set of values. On one of these, the thing that you are going to upload and that people will look at the most is the picture of your face. On another one of these, the thing that you will upload that will get looked at the most before you are selected is not a picture of your face. These are all aspects of human emotionality and sexuality, but they are partitioned in interesting ways, according to a particular business logic. Now, as a social scientist, if I have access to these data sets, what am I finding out and what am I missing? And how am I putting the parameters around my conclusions? How am I phrasing that? Anyone ever filled one of these out? It's a dating site, but I bet you've done profiles. The categories of what matters for the matching algorithms are pre-specified by people who may or may not be designers, may or may not be psychologists, and almost certainly are not social scientists. That does not mean we can't learn something interesting. What it means is that we have to be careful about our conclusions and about the quality of the data for purpose, for us. Huge numbers of really, really excellent comments on what you should do for your profile. So even if you're not doing a checkbox, there are norms of how you represent yourself if you actually want to be successful online and get that date. So I could, in fact, and I do, think that walking along the beach at sunset holding hands is profoundly dull. But if you put it up on one of these sites, it turns out you're probably more successful. Because that's how we code in our culture what constitutes a romantic person who has meaningful intentions toward another. And I think that's important to know, because actually over here, we have the top 10 Indian dating sites. And I don't personally know what looks like a really good profile there. Elizabeth Goodman, who's a PhD student at UC Berkeley, and I did some comparative studies of different countries and dating sites. And there are different emphases on what constitutes a marriageable or dateable or engageable person. I think that that's interesting. Great research out there. Many of these papers, I've read them all, many of them are really excellent, make great observations about things like homophily, how like you are someone else, how like you are to pick someone who looks like yourself. Lying. Lying is actually, when you keep changing that profile, Elizabeth Goodman and I found that people often change the profile because they just like to have more results to choose from, not because they're necessarily lying to the other person. They are in a deep conversation with the algorithms, not necessarily the people they're hoping to date. They are in a deep conversation with a set of algorithms that will represent them through algorithmic match to other people. So that's a really, now we only found that out because we weren't doing the data science. We were doing a different kind of data science. We were doing qualitative data analysis. We went out and we sat with people, we talked with two people, we watched them fill profiles. We watched them horrified and mortified by lack of results and too many results and the wrong results. We actually went and watched people get ready to go out. And we interviewed them when they came back from dates, assuming the date was not really successful. And you know what we found? We found incredible amounts of anxiety, issues with self-identity, self-reflection. We found that people were going out and buying clothes and changing the way they looked and doing all kinds of things. And most of those papers don't talk about that. They allude to it, but they don't talk about the psychology of that incredible anxiety. There are, of course, exceptions. There's a lovely book here. Again, to Ben's point about interdisciplinarity, this is not an experimental psychology nor a data science book. It's a book about the marketplace of dating, about the ways in which we learn to construct ourselves, to put ourselves on the dating marketplace. Some really interesting insights in that book about the phenomenology of being on a dating site. So that was just one example where all I'm trying to do is just get you to think differently about what the data are that are collected. Is there a clock here?
I am your clock.
All right. Flickr. Yay, who has a Flickr account? Yay! Flickr is why I went to Yahoo. I love Flickr. And that's me on Flickr. Those are my data, my stats. I'm not particularly viewed. I have these little spikes. This makes me talk about anxiety. This makes me profoundly sad about myself. I'm like, oh, nobody likes me. So you're about to see a map, and what I want you to think about is the privacy settings on Flickr. So this was work, again, done with Tony Lamb, done several years ago. And the privacy settings on Flickr allow you to make things, private, only to your friends, only a certain network, or completely public. And so one of the things that we did was we had a look at what percentage of people's pictures, we took a sample, what percentage of people's pictures were public versus private. And we put it on a map. And red means most of them are private, green means most of them are public. Now, a bunch of you have seen this before, but what I wanted to actually say about this was we were only playing around with the data, asking questions that came out of a bunch of interviews around data privacy. Because the predominant assumption was that people don't really change their privacy settings that much, or, you know, it's pretty general, because nobody had actually mapped or asked the question about location. This is self-reported location. And so by actually having a kind of social science sensibility around cultural difference, and a couple of people mentioned that when we were introducing ourselves, allowed us to go in and just visualize this. Now, it didn't answer any questions, but what it did do was lead to a whole program of research using discourse analysis and interviews to try and find out more about how people felt about private versus public. And over there, the reason, you know, we did interviews and did discourse analysis and content analysis, the folks over in Scandinavia were just, their discourse around what it means to be private wasn't just, I'm afraid that you're going to see my stuff and rip me off or come down to my house. It was also around politeness. People don't need to have to see all of my stuff. Whereas over here, when we talk to people in San Francisco and other areas, they were like, yeah, if you find my stuff, that's your problem. You know, you get to sift through my stuff. And so there was a social responsibility about what it is appropriate to communicate to a public and to your social group or not. And I just thought that was an interesting result. There's a lot more on that I will share if anyone wants to ask. The next thing, how many people know about the Flickr Commons? Great. So, you know, I'm going from the personal and the private and the emotional to the kind of cultural and bigger picture of...
I have a simple question just on the perimeters page.
Yeah.
Is that the data Flickr?
Yeah. It's an old data set from about 2006.
So I'm curious about why the area of China and Africa.
Because it was a sparse data problem. I mean, there were only, at 2006, there were not that many people from China nor India who were actually online on Flickr. And so what we have there was just a sample taken from an old data set. And so the specific details of the numbers is not what I want you to take away. What I want you to take away was that only by surfacing and applying that method of interrogating the data in a particular way did we actually start to see something interesting that led to a set of very qualitative research questions. It was a good question, though, so thank you for letting me clarify that. So the Flickr Commons. Photos on Flickr, I'm going to get to that point about, you know, the social responsibility point rather than the personal psychology point, which is that the Library of Congress, the Powerhouse Museum, the Smithsonian, the New York Public Library, Cornell University Library, and others are putting up pictures that have only been held in archives up onto Flickr for people to share and to look at. This is a super exciting, amazingly exciting initiative. It's been around for a few years. Please go and look at it. There's some fantastic pictures. And this is really what Ben was talking around. You know, this might be history rather than science, but you know, it's not the Hubble. It's the Hubble of the history of social sharing. The amount of comments that people are putting on these pictures. This is really crowdsourcing, and it's everything from kind of, you know, phatic emotional. My gosh, that's a fantastic picture, through to that was a picture of my grandmother, and she was a riveter, and her name was blah 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 blah. You know, and that is a picture of the house where I grew up in, you know, 19 whatever, mumble. And it's absolutely fantastic data set, history data set, as well as a data set around social collaboration and storytelling and the telling of place and time. You know? Here's one which is, it's one of the examples that's used very frequently, and I'm going to just put a paper up to show you that I really recommend reading this paper, because the paper makes some very nice points on this notion of social media and what constitutes data. So these are notes. So Flickr, remember the interface elements, allows you to put notes on. This is one of the most notated images in the Commons, right? And if you read, it's everything from cool to that's a blah, 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 and there's some technical information there. Now, notes are allowed, and notes were clearly designed to put one or two on. Actually trying to read these, it's a design issue, right? It's really quite hard trying to read them and pick them out and work out the metadata. You know, when were they put, by who, is this a person that I should trust, or whatever, right? But those data are amazing. And again, I want to, if you get a chance to read this paper, please have a look at it. because they talk a lot about what are the data and what are the metadata and how you can and cannot extract certain things to tell certain kinds of stories about the telling of the history of these pictures. They've got a whole bunch of really super smart people working on this problem. They also don't really even know how to do the evaluation of, is this an engaged audience or not? Because people are putting links to these on their personal sites. And so the data of what the influence and impact is of this image are spread across so many different places and so many different sources that it sort of feels like it's impossible to really collate what does this mean to a culture or to an individual. And they do a really nice job in this paper of talking about some of those details. And the other thing is, I wanted to bring up this last point really about longevity, data longevity. They say, like all Commons members, Flickr Commons member, the other qualitative measure we value highly is the sheer inventiveness of Flickr members who engage with the photographs. What are the metrics for inventiveness? Are they available? Are they available through the data that we can collect through the Flickr API or not? Currently, Cornell saves links to examples of reuse on Delicious and displays them as a feed on its website. So there are other places where these are being collected, other platforms. Remember I was talking about decentralized versus centralized? And I just want to say, Delicious changed during the time between that research and now. And I just want to put up here that Yahoo was really responsible in giving us a transition period to move, to take our accounts. I was just not paying attention and I missed it. I lost all my Delicious links. Now, my personal responsibility, I should have notionally known that I had a very narrow window to do it, and I should have taken action to do it. I wonder how many other people forgot in the window. I don't spend my whole life monitoring. It's like blooming gardening, trying to keep track of all of these things. Right? Now, what about Flickr now? Professional photographers are starting to leave because the site, the interface, has not been being updated and invested in. People are claiming that Flickr is dead. I love Flickr. I would do anything to save Flickr. Now, this is not the only one of these examples. Anybody remember Hometown? Gone. People like me missed the deadline for getting their stuff out. Gone. What a shambles. That's an emotion. Who's charting the metric of this emotion? Shouldn't that be part of our social psychological agenda of the psychology, the Hubble telescope of what does it mean to be online? GeoCities. Because this person moved to GeoCities, right? Gone. And it's not just Yahoo. Just so that we're all really clear. Ben mentioned this earlier. And APIs.
Yeah.
Twitter just announced this a few days ago.
Yeah.
Right. You know? What are we going to do about it? Business logic is not science logic. There are reasons why these things are closing. There is a bottom line that a company needs to make. Again, I'm not trying to make a moral judgment. I'm trying to make a kind of science judgment around the ethics and who's participating in the conversation and how. So, that's what I've been focusing on, the second point. And I'm also kind of focusing on the requirements for science. We've sort of talked about it, and Ben brought this up a little bit. Now, I'm really pretty old. And so I had a whole training in science that was maybe a little bit too kind of positivistic and reductive back in the day when we actually cared about a sample and a population were. And we didn't just say, the bigger the number, it doesn't really matter. I still don't quite believe that. Stability, the existence of content in an accessible form and hopefully the same format over time would be lovely. Is it possible? What happens if we don't have it? What's the new science? Science, for me, was about consistency, recoding the data the same way. Remember I said the massaging right at the beginning, data science is about massaging, right? Reproducibility. Now, I want to just point out that these were actually points taken from not just experimental science, but also when I was doing I was moving from experimental science in the lab to getting really excited about content analysis and content science and content analytic approaches. And everyone was telling me if I moved from quantitative to qualitative, I was going to have to be more rigorous because no one would believe me. And so we really thought about consistency and reproducibility and accuracy. And we really thought about validity and the notion of what constitutes proof. We were really careful. How many people were trained in like Atlas TI and other things where you actually were so careful about your codes? God help us, we're going to shove them out to give them to everybody to make sure that the inter-rater reliability was there. Where's that? Where are we going to have that? Generalizability, and I really liked the interventions. How are those going to be compared, really? And maybe it's all been solved, but if it has, can everyone in the room tell me? Because I need to know. All right, the point I made at the beginning. We need to have everybody, and the epistemologists and ontologists in the room thinking about this. Now, have I depressed you all? No, because this is our chance. We have to come and get together, think about this, and think about how we're going to address this going forward. So back to Ben's point. As you're doing your specific detailed research, think about how we can actually learn the lessons of what's hard. Like Esther's going to be talking, right? Esther did a wonderful book, which was basically on, things that weren't reproducible and didn't go according to plan and things that were hard in doing qualitative and quantitative methods. We want to be sharing these things. What's easy, what's hard, where's the massaging occurring, where are the data sets disappearing? I want to hear about that. And I think if we can hear about that, we can start to provide some of the collective substrate behind going forward to get the Hubble telescope model stable and at least discussable. Right, lampoon me. Thank you.
We're going to take some time for questions. And
The lampooning happened in Twitter.
yeah, right.
Oh, did?
That's not true.
Right.
I'm British. I feel the love even if you're shouting at me.
Hi. Thanks for the talk. So you talked about data and how you can get stable data. And you say that business logic is separate from science logic. But we as scientists are dependent on those businesses to give us large-scale data because we are not in the business of making that data.
Yep.
And it's always difficult to get data from companies, as you would know.
I know. Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on that going forward?
I don't know, and I think, that's kind of what I would like to have as a discussion in this group. Because I know, and Ben pointed this out, that many companies actually want to do the right thing. But they don't necessarily have the time or the resources to do it effectively. And there are piecemeal efforts, like internships. Internships are certainly not piecemeal, but you know what I mean? And data sharing agreements, and visiting scholars, and so forth. And so I think companies are really trying hard to do the right thing by the data, and they really want to hear from scientists about how to collect what data in a computationally effective and resource-effective way. And so I think what we need to do is actually make it easier for them to help us, and for them to help us going forward. How do we make requests that are really rooted in a collective science agenda, not just a personal and individual one? How do we think about things like privacy going forward so that we can protect the company's requirements on privacy as an individuals, as well as answer our science needs? So I think you just asked the question in a really beautifully summarized way. And what I would like us to do is think about how we can share stories to take this forward as a constructive, collective agenda, not a set of individual research results, another paper.
There's not.
Well, I guess you sort of talked about, do we have the right data? Are we looking at the right data? Is it only the available data? And I guess sometimes it feels like we're talking about this sort of mythical good data that exists, where the data is in the same format over time, it's from the same, we get a complete picture of all the data, we have access to the data we really want. And I feel like a lot of the kind of science that we do is basing our results on that mythical good data instead of the actuality, which is every big data set I've ever seen is kind of crazy and terrible and really kind of just traumatic to look at and go, what am I going to do with that? And I guess my question is, do you feel like there's a certain amount of, we have to reorient ourselves to look at what data actually looks like now, as opposed to the idea of it?
So I would argue exactly the opposite. I would argue that people are playing with the messy data and claiming results that actually make us assume that those data aren't quite so messy. They're not revealing the everyday practices of that misogyny and cleaning. And that's the agenda I want to take forward, to reveal the practices, not because those practices are bad, and not because there is an ideal end to this, but because then there is an accountability, and there is a sort of rhetorical way in which we can interrogate the results to understand where the latitude is and where we could actually do some slightly different things, including making recommendations back to corporations about how they can collect cleaner data, which will result in a business result for them as well as a science result for us.
Don't you think that there's incentive problem in the sciences, in the sense that we're motivated to, when we're trying to get our papers published, right, we're incentivized to say, look, I've solved the world's problems, and that's why you publish this paper. Is there a way around that?
I don't know. I hope there is. And I actually think, when I was a graduate student, we wanted to have a journal. I think there might have been something out, I don't know if it was real or not, but the Journal of Non-Significant Results. Right? And actually Esther's book, which is really looking at the problematics of certain kinds of research, is one step in that direction. And I think this kind of sharing is the way we start to get the messiness of science, and in all of its glorious messiness, right, sort of forward to maybe start addressing that institutional requirement as well. I don't know. It could be as simple as, at the end of our papers, we always get to write what was hard. Some journals like this, some don't. Some conferences like it, some don't. When I was writing pure theoretical experimental psychology journal papers, and I always wanted to apply it, like if you do implicit learning, this is what you find, this is how you apply it to a design situation. I was told to take that messy bit out. And of course what I did was I left experimental psychology and became a design person. But I wonder if there's a way that we could collectively just get the whole community moving forward to talking differently about this. I think that's.
Let me just add to that and remind you that Zeynep Tufekci and Lee Rainey will be speaking Thursday at the Brookings, are both addressing this issue. Zeynep's current paper about what's wrong with big data has provoked some discussion. Jimmy Lin, who Jenny's faculty member, who spent 2 years on sabbatical at Twitter, really responded about how the people there are really attending to this. He claims they're devoted and very careful and trying to make these careful assumptions. So, careful refinements to the data so that it can be used. So the pressure of people in this community is extremely important. You do need to speak up about the problems you faced and the difficulties that make it hard to run science. I might say at the same time, this is a substantive enough issue to provoke a research paper about how to clean up social data. I just read the very powerful arguments about the climate science data. Richard Muller of Berkeley turned around, and he was a climate skeptic, and now he's a climate supporter. They wrote 5 papers on this. One of those papers was entirely about how they cleaned the data from 35,000 observation sites over 250 years. A whole paper just about data cleaning. We're not the only ones with data problems, and that's really important to make it a national priority so that we work with reasonable data.
Agreed. Thank you very much.
I saw another question. We'll take one more.
I don't want to make anyone late.
All right, my name is Patrick Xie from Northwestern. I'm just an open question, actually. So when we think about big data, I'm just keep thinking whether that's just the current narrative is maybe just about one dimension of the big data, in the sense that actually if we're doing qualitative research, going to the site, doing ethnography and whatnot, actually we could utilize the technologies to do a lot of detailed logging rather than just thinking about what's our enclaves on each of these sites. Where yes, there are big data, but we could I just don't know whether we should start thinking about the other dimensions of big data.
Absolutely, absolutely. And some of the work that I've done with Ayman Sharma at Yahoo, he and I were looking at how you log social media systems for experience mining and for kind of more kind of ethnographic insights. What logging do you do? And I think your question provokes an even bigger agenda around that. And I'd love for us to discuss what that might look like in the next few days. Great.
All right, thank you.